Imagine waking up one morning to find 96 brand new houses being built on your land and realizing nobody even asked you for permission. Because right there on your property, massive bulldozers are ripping through the ground, uprooting trees, flattening soil, and carting roads like they own the place. That's exactly what happened to David Turner, a quiet 58-year-old retiree in Florida. A man who lived a slow, peaceful life, taking care of the same land his father had bought more than 40 years ago. That land was more than property to him. It was memory, history, and family. But that morning, everything changed, because the unthinkable happened. A powerful homeowners association and a wealthy construction company had made a catastrophic mistake. A mistake so big it would later cost them millions, due to an error in paperwork, wrong coordinates, wrong mapping, wrong assumptions. David's 12-acre land was accidentally included in a massive new housing development project. The HOA didn't bother to double-check the ownership. The construction company didn't verify the deed. And the county, thinking everything was in order, approved it all. So in just a few weeks, trucks rolled in, foundations were poured, and walls started going up. And before David could even process what was happening, 96 brand new homes were literally rising on his land. Homes built on ground his father once plowed with his own hands. Homes built on soil he had protected for decades. Homes built without his permission. When he finally gathered himself, marched toward the construction site, and confronted the foreman, his voice echoed with anger. "Stop building! This is my property!" The foreman didn't argue. He didn't panic. He simply pulled out a clipboard with a printed site map and said calmly, "No, sir. According to our plan, this belongs to the Lakeside HOA." To the HOA, not David. Not his family. David stared at the map in disbelief. It didn't matter what the paper said. He had the original deed, properly recorded, legally accurate, and passed down through generations. David knew the truth. He owned the land. He had the proof. But instead of exploding in anger, calling the sheriff, or immediately hiring a lawyer, David made a decision so shocking that even the judge would later call it strategic genius. He let them continue. Yes, you read that right. He didn't stop the bulldozers. He didn't block the construction. He didn't protest at City Hall. He simply went back home and waited. Every day he walked the borders of his property with a camera. He recorded every new foundation poured. He photographed every construction truck entering his land. He collected every notice, permit, blueprint, and mail the HOA sent him by accident. He kept every document in a thick folder labeled evidence. In his words, the more they built, the more the land was worth, and the more they built, the more they owed me. Weeks turned into months. Houses rose, roofs were installed, roads were paved, and buyers started reserving units, completely unaware that their future homes were standing on land that legally belonged to someone else. By the time the HOA finally realized something was wrong, it was too late. The construction was almost finished. Millions of dollars had already been invested, and 96 families were waiting to move in. The HOA tried to contact David politely. They invited him to the office. They offered him a small settlement to adjust the boundary. But when David walked into the meeting room, he didn't negotiate. He didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply pulled out a thick, yellowing document, the original deed, signed and notarized decades ago. The room went silent. One of the directors whispered, "This can't be real." It was real. The HOA panicked. The construction company panicked. Their lawyers panicked. They threatened David. They claimed he should have informed them earlier. They said the county approved the map. They blamed everyone except themselves. But David remained calm. He had exactly what he needed. Because every single house on that 12-acre land belonged to him. By law, by deed, by right. And he wasn't about to be pushed aside. David turned to the HOA's attorney and said, "I didn't stop you, because every nail you hammered increased the value of what you now owe me." And that's when the real battle began. The HOA and the construction company had made a massive, career-ending paperwork mistake, the kind of blunder that starts small but spirals into a disaster worth millions. It all began when someone, somewhere, at a desk inside the planning department, entered the wrong coordinates into the development map. A tiny mistake, a tiny typo. But that one wrong number shifted the project boundary directly onto David's 12-acre property. From that moment forward, every meeting, every blueprint, every permit the HOA signed off on was based on that incorrect map. And because the HOA trusted the construction company, and the construction company trusted the survey team, and the survey team trusted the county records, the mistake spread like wildfire. Nobody questioned it. Nobody double-checked. Nobody thought, hey, maybe this land actually belongs to someone. They simply assumed it was theirs. But the worst part, the county approved it, stamped it, registered it, made it official. And that single approval turned one person's mistake into a full-scale development green light. Now, David could have stopped everything on day one. He could have walked into the county office with his deed and shut down the project before the first shovel touched the ground. He could have sued immediately and frozen every move the HOA made. He could have called the sheriff, blocked the trucks, put up fencing, and ended the entire project in one afternoon. But he didn't. David didn't yell. He didn't fight. He didn't rush into the chaos like most people would. Instead, he stayed silent. Every morning, he would stand at his porch with a cup of coffee and quietly watch the bulldozers crawl across his land like giant metal insects. He watched foundations being poured. He watched lumber delivered. He watched nails hammered, roofs lifted, fences placed. And each day his smirk grew a little wider, because David understood something the HOA didn't. They were building on land he owned. Every brick they laid increased their leverage. Every house they finished made the mistake more expensive. He opened a folder, a thick, leather-bound file he would later jokingly call his $1,000,000 scrapbook. Inside, he collected everything: photos of trucks entering his property, videos of workers installing pipes, copies of construction blueprints for every home, permits the HOA accidentally mailed to him, drone footage of the expanding neighborhood, screenshots of public records with incorrect coordinates. David documented every single detail, almost like he was archiving evidence for a documentary. In his words, "The more they built, the more valuable my case became." And he was right. Each house had value. Each road had value. Each sidewalk, each power line, each water pipe, all of it increased the cost of their mistake. By the time the HOA finally suspected something was wrong, David had already built a perfect timeline of their blunder. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The HOA president called the construction manager, whispering urgently, "Why does the county GIS map say this parcel belongs to, David Turner?" Silence. The construction manager scrambled through documents. Papers flew, maps opened, emails were rechecked, and then the nightmare hit them. 12 acres of their project wasn't theirs. Not the roads, not the homes, not even the grass. Everything they built, all of it, stood on land they did not own. The HOA panicked. The construction company panicked. Lawyers panicked. They rushed to David's house. They called. They emailed. They offered meetings, boundary discussions, and mutual settlements. But David waited. Calm, silent, prepared. Because by the time they realized the truth, millions of dollars were already sunk into the project. Materials purchased, workers paid, homes nearly sold. Everything, absolutely everything, rested on land belonging to one quiet, strategic retiree. And David was ready. He wasn't the victim in this story. He wasn't the powerless homeowner. He wasn't the man being pushed around. He was the man with the deed, the man with the evidence, the man holding the fate of 96 newly built homes. And he knew the next move wasn't theirs. It was his. 6 months had passed since David Turner first saw bulldozers tearing through his land. Months in which he had stayed silent, documenting every detail, every truck, every nail hammered into foundations he owned. And now, the HOA decided to make their move. One morning, David received a polite phone call from the HOA president. The voice on the line was cordial, almost friendly. "Mr. Turner, we'd like to discuss a boundary adjustment." David smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He had been expecting this call. He knew exactly why they were reaching out. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It wasn't a desire to make things right. It was damage control, and David was ready for them. When he arrived at the HOA office, the tension in the room was palpable. The directors, once confident and in control, now appeared uneasy. Their smiles were forced. Their hands fidgeted with pens and papers. They presented him with a document. On the surface, it seemed harmless, a small settlement offer in exchange for David signing away his rights to the land. They tried to act casually, as if this was a normal, routine procedure. David didn't rush. He didn't argue. He simply took the document, laid it on the table, and looked each director in the eyes. Then he asked one simple, pointed question. "Before I sign anything, whose land do you think you've been building on?" The room froze. The directors looked at each other, confused. Whispers filled the air. A few stammered, unsure what to say. David calmly reached into his briefcase and pulled out the original deed. The deed was clean, stamped, notarized, and legally unassailable. It had been in his family for decades. It was perfect. He placed it on the table. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. One director finally whispered, almost in disbelief, "This can't be real." It was real. The realization hit them all at once. Every road, every pipe, every foundation, every single home had been built on land that legally belonged to David Turner. Panic spread across the room like wildfire. The HOA directors' faces drained of color. Their confident air had evaporated. For the first time, they understood that their mistake had massive consequences. The HOA tried to defend themselves. They pointed fingers at the county, claiming they had relied on official maps. They argued that the construction company had misled them. They even implied David was trying to extort them. But David didn't need to argue. He had proof. He presented every single piece of evidence he had been collecting for 6 months. Construction permits they accidentally mailed to him. Copies of blueprints for every home. Photographs of trucks and workers on his land. Time-stamped videos of foundations being poured. Detailed notes documenting each step of the construction. It was overwhelming evidence, all pointing to one fact. 96 homes had been built on his property without permission. Things escalated quickly. The HOA lawyer demanded David stop making claims, warning him of legal consequences. The construction company threatened lawsuits of their own. A frantic staff member even told him, "The homes are already sold. You can't do anything now." David stayed calm. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. Because he knew something they didn't. He was untouchable. Every attempt to intimidate him, every threat only strengthened his position. He had the law on his side, he had proof, and he had patience. As the room buzzed with panic and whispers, David leaned back and said something that would later be quoted by reporters. "You've been building on my land. Every nail you drove, every house you raised, increased what you now owe me. And this isn't about threats. This is about justice." The directors flinched. The lawyers went silent. For the first time, David was in complete control. What started as a simple, polite meeting quickly became the turning point in a story that would make headlines. For the HOA and construction company, the message was clear. They had underestimated David Turner, and that mistake would cost them dearly. By the time David left that office, he had already begun planning his next move, the move that would ultimately turn his silent patience into a multi-million-dollar victory. Because while the HOA and developers had been panicking, David had been smiling quietly, knowing that letting them finish building was the smartest decision he had ever made. He wasn't just a homeowner. He wasn't just a retiree. He was a master strategist, holding all the cards in a game nobody else even realized they were playing. David Turner wasn't the type to rush into arguments or shout over lawyers. He knew the power of patience, and he had spent 6 months quietly gathering evidence while the HOA and construction company unknowingly built a multi-million-dollar mistake on his land. When it came time to act, he did so in a way that would shock everyone. He filed a lawsuit so straightforward, so airtight, that even the judge remarked with a chuckle during the first hearing, "This might be the cleanest property case I've ever seen." David wasn't asking the court to tear down a single house. He wasn't demanding the construction stop mid-project. He didn't want to disrupt families or create chaos. He wanted one thing, and one thing only. "I want compensation for every house built on my land." It was simple, it was fair, and it struck fear into the hearts of the HOA and developers who had assumed they could sweep the issue under the rug. The courtroom quickly became a battleground of excuses, but none of them held up. The HOA tried first. "We didn't know." "The county approved it," they said. "The maps told them the land was theirs. They hadn't intended to trespass." The construction company stepped in, shifting blame. "The developer is responsible," they said. "They handled the permits. We were just following instructions." And when even that failed, a desperate attempt was made to shift responsibility onto David himself. "He should have told us earlier," the lawyers argued. But none of it mattered. Not a single excuse could undo the mountains of evidence David had meticulously gathered. The judge, an experienced and stern woman who clearly recognized the simplicity and brilliance of David's case, asked the most important question of the day. "Did you build 96 homes on land that is legally his?" The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned to the HOA lawyer. He hesitated. He shuffled papers nervously, searching for an answer that didn't exist. Finally, he spoke, almost reluctantly. "My clients relied on incorrect county mapping." The judge cut him off sharply. "That's not the question." A long pause followed. The tension was almost tangible. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. Then, in a quiet, defeated tone, the lawyer admitted the truth. "Yes, Your Honor, the homes were built on his land." That was the moment everything flipped. From that instant, the power in the room shifted. The HOA, which had assumed authority over the land, now realized they were dealing with a man who had been patient, strategic, and unflinchingly prepared. Every home, every road, every pipe they had installed on David's property now became a financial liability, a debt owed to him. The judge leaned back slightly, clearly impressed by the simplicity and clarity of the case. She studied the deeds, the photographs, the permits, and the videos and detailed construction logs David had submitted. One by one, the evidence painted a clear picture. The HOA and developers had built 96 homes on property they did not own. Even the defense lawyers had to admit it. They couldn't argue against the fact that the deeds were legal, notarized, and verified. The photographs captured trucks, workers, and foundations precisely where David's property line had been. Every blueprint confirmed the mistake. Every permit was an unintentional gift to David's case. David's strategy had worked perfectly. By letting the homes be built, he had increased the value of his claim exponentially. The HOA had assumed that completing construction would make the land theirs in some practical sense. But David knew better. He had transformed their investment into a financial weapon. By the time the hearing ended, the tone in the courtroom had completely changed. The HOA and construction company were no longer confident. They were anxious, desperate, and aware that they were about to pay a massive price for their mistake. And David, he remained calm, composed, and quietly confident. His patience, his meticulous documentation, and his understanding of the law had turned a terrifying situation into a position of absolute strength. That single acknowledgement, "Yes, Your Honor, the homes were built on his land," was not just a legal victory. It was a turning point, a moment that guaranteed that David Turner was no longer fighting for recognition. He was now in a position to claim what was rightfully his, and the HOA and developers had no choice but to comply. For David, the months of watching, recording, and waiting had paid off, and now the final phase of his plan, the financial settlement, was just beginning. Because in that courtroom, the tables had completely turned, and the man who had once silently watched bulldozers tear through his property now held the ultimate power. After 3 grueling hearings, months of strategic legal maneuvering, and a courtroom drama that captivated the county, the judge finally delivered a verdict that would go down in local legal history. The room was tense. Lawyers leaned forward in their seats. HOA directors fidgeted nervously, and even the construction company executives looked pale and uncertain. But in the center of it all, David Turner remained calm, collected, confident, and quiet. The judge cleared her throat and read aloud. The HOA and the developer are hereby ordered to pay David Turner full market value for his property. This includes the 12 acres of land, every square foot used for roads, utility lines, and the value of the 96 completed homes built on his property. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. People whispered to one another, unable to fully comprehend the scale of the ruling. The homes weren't just partially constructed, they were finished, sold, and ready for occupancy. Families were prepared to move in, unaware that the ground beneath their new homes did not legally belong to the developer. For a moment, the room froze. The HOA directors exchanged panicked glances. The construction executives whispered urgently amongst themselves. They realized with sinking horror that their massive oversight would now cost millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars. And then the twist that nobody had anticipated. Because the homes were already pre-sold, the developers faced a nightmare scenario. Every family was counting on moving in. The developers could not simply tear the houses down or cancel the sales. They would face lawsuits, angry buyers, and public outrage. Their only realistic option was to buy the entire property from David Turner at a premium price. David had anticipated this. He had waited patiently, recording every truck, every blueprint, every foundation. He had turned what could have been a disaster into a once-in-a-lifetime financial victory. The settlement negotiations that followed were swift. The developers, desperate to avoid losing even more money and to salvage their reputation, agreed to David's terms. By the end of the process, he walked away with a settlement rumored to be over $14 million. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle of the matter, the satisfaction of having been rightfully patient, methodical, and smart. David had taken a situation that would have crushed most homeowners and transformed it into a story of triumph. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust toward him as journalists clamored for a statement. One reporter asked the question everyone wanted to know. "Mr. Turner, did you ever think of stopping them earlier?" David paused. He looked out across the crowd of flashing lights, the microphones, and the scribbling reporters. Then he smiled, a calm, knowing smile that seemed to say he had already played the entire game perfectly. "No," he said, simply. "I let them finish, because the more they built, the more they owed me." The statement echoed far beyond the courthouse. It became a headline in local newspapers, a story shared across social media, and a cautionary tale for developers and homeowners everywhere. David's patience and strategic thinking had turned a mistake into a multi-million-dollar windfall. But the story wasn't just about the money. It was about the power of patience, documentation, and staying calm under pressure. David had not acted rashly. He had not fought the bulldozers head-on. Instead, he had observed, documented, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. By allowing the construction to proceed, he had increased the value of his claim exponentially. Every completed home, every paved road, every utility line had become leverage in his favor. What could have been a nightmare of trespass and property violation became a story of legal mastery. As David left the courthouse that day, he carried more than just a check. He carried a lesson for the world. Sometimes patience is the most powerful strategy of all. The HOA and construction company, meanwhile, were left to rebuild their reputations and deal with the fallout of a simple mistake that had spiraled into an unforgettable courtroom saga. And David? He returned to his land, not just as the legal owner, but as a man who had outsmarted bureaucracy, law, and greed, proving that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards.